Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, a podcast bringing students and academics together to explore the research carried out by the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences and the impact this work has on society.
Hi there, welcome to the podcast. My name is Gilly Marchini. I'm a third year PhD student in linguistics here at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'm joined by Christian Ilbury, who is a lecturer in sociolinguistics here, whose work primarily focuses on the social meaning of linguistic variation. Christian joined the department in 2022 after previously holding posts at Queen Mary University in London and the University of Suffolk, amongst others. I won't give too much away right now, as we will be discussing lots later, but Christian's research interests lie in the interrelation between digital culture and language variation and change, particularly amongst young people and the LGBTQ+ community. This podcast episode will last roughly 20 minutes, during which time I'll ask Christian several questions related to social media and language change. But Christian, firstly, welcome. And I will first ask you to provide an elevator pitch on your research. So can you tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm interested in how digital culture, how digital technologies have perhaps changed or influenced how we interact or use language. So what that means in more general terms is do things like social media change the way that we use language? Does that lead to perhaps, as is claimed in media often, new varieties of language emerging in social media? Does it lead to us using language in different ways to pre-digital eras? So my interest really is trying to unpick how digital culture, how digital technologies are influencing or interacting with the language that we use.
Fabulous. And what inspired you to begin looking into this?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up at a time when the internet had just become widespread. So in the 90s, the internet rapidly went from something that very few people could access to then very many people could access. And as one of those people that was at one point referred to as a digital native, I was interested in like running home from school and getting on MSN Messenger and messaging all my friends. And I was thinking about at that point already, things are changing quite rapidly in how I interact with my friends. So what we might have done before in terms of like hang out after school then became like a digital space, like we would hang out on MSN Messenger. And at that point, I was really interested in how that might be influencing or changing the way that I interacted or used language across these different contexts.
That's really, so it's all comes from personal experience in this way.
Yeah, I guess it's that thing where, as an academic, a lot of what we do is tied to lived experience. And, as somebody that, I grew up and I was kind of rapidly trying to get to the next best social media site or messaging site. I was trying to keep up with the trends, and now my research tries to understand those trends.
That's really interesting. And sort of, I know recently you've published some work on this.
Mm-hmm.
So this handbook for students. So can you sort of tell us a little bit about that?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Yes. So you have recently published that book on the sort of the practicalities of researching digital media and language variation. So can you sort of talk through some of what that book is?
Yeah, sure.
And also sort of what are the practicalities that people have to consider when they're working with this kind of research?
Yeah, so the book that I've just released is called Researching Language and Digital Communication, and it's intended to be a student guide for people who are interested in looking at language variation in digital context. So at Edinburgh, I teach a guided research course in the sociolinguistics of digital communication. And I kind of realized that there was a bit of a gap in the market. So there are books on language and social media, but they're primarily focused on the discourses of social media. So how do people, for instance, what are the discursive qualities of hate speech? How do people narrate small stories or big stories on social media? Whereas I'm interested more in social media and the relevance of that for language variation change. So, like how that might influence, like, how we use different varieties of language. So, this textbook was essentially an attempt to walk the student reader through some of that theory, some of those approaches, but also help them design a research project on some aspect of digital communication. So that might be looking at, for instance, the variable use of lol, right? So, something that originally meant something like laugh out loud to very many of us now doesn't really mean that, or you can use it in a context where I would hope that most people wouldn't find like funny or directly funny. So it essentially helps the student think about how they could get from the point where they develop an initial seed of an idea, so looking at lol, to them being able to collect the data, to them being able to analyze that data, and then make sense of what's going on there in using sociolinguistic concepts and frameworks that are tied to understanding language variation.
That sounds like would be very handy, particularly like when you start
Mm-hmm.
researching a project. It can be so hard to know where to start.
Yeah.
So kind of having that baseline of being like, oh, this is perhaps something that you could do to help.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
imagine there are like several challenges with
Yeah.
working with digital media, because traditional methods, this method of analyzing linguistic variation is pretty recent, as you said.
Yeah.
So there isn't a lot of groundwork on how to do it. So are there any specific challenges you think
Yeah.
relate specifically to digital media use?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, right?
Yeah,
And so,
yeah.
like the chapter on methods in my book, it's very long, and some of the issues that kind of immediately come to mind are, as you say, like this was a field that was predicated on studying language variation in spoken language, and quite a lot of what we have developed is fine to use to understand how people use variation in spoken interaction, but it's questionable whether it can be directly applied to digital media and to social media. So that's already like a theoretical challenge, but there's other issues with studying digital media, primarily because it changes so rapidly. Ethical guidelines, which are often developed by universities and other institutions, um, are often at the point where they haven't caught up yet with what people are doing. So even if you look at most ethical guidance now, there's very little on, say, TikTok, which is now for most young people the most popular platform of use. And that means that you have to be quite agile in how you approach digital media. You have to be quite self reflexive. I often think, and I often say to students, in digital cultural research, you have to think, would I be happy with a researcher using this? Yeah, it might be in the public domain, but that doesn't mean that we can just use that data or extract that data. So that's an issue. And I mean, you can think about various changes to particular platforms that have kind of complicated this. So recently, Twitter, or now it's known as X, we used to be able to get data from the API, so from the back end, in a very straightforward manner. But things have changed. You now need to pay to get access to this. So quite a lot of work had used these methods that you relied on this method, and then things changed, and you have to think about what those kind of platform changes mean for us as researchers. So these are kind of some main issues that students struggle with. But I think the other issue is, there's a lot that we could study on social media, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's interesting to a sociolinguist, right? So just because it's language in use doesn't mean it's directly relevant to what we're interested in. So I think sometimes students struggle with trying to find the sociolinguistic relevance of a topic, and that's what my textbook tries to do, is show that yeah, there's this field called digital culture and digital sociology, and they're interested in something. And we also are interested in things that overlap with that, but our focus is more so on language in that context.
Yeah, and is there like a nice specific example you can think of where digital media has had an influence on language use?
Yeah, I mean, so the question of digital media and influence is one that's quite slippery. So, like,
Of course.
if you look in media, there are, hundreds of articles suggesting that TikTok has led to a new accent, or that Instagram has created this new variety of language. But when you unpick it, it's actually much more complex than that. So, what people have tended to do throughout time is assume that technology changes society in ways that are really quite significant and beyond what we'd seen before. This is what people refer to as technological determinism.
Yeah.
The idea that technology directly influences society and we are just kind of complicit in this. Whereas the research has shown that actually it's a bit more complex than that. And more contemporary research has moved away from viewing an influence effect on language towards suggesting that this kind of relationship between media and language might be a bit more indirect, and it might do things beyond simply just influencing whether we use like variant A or variant B. Right, so rather than like creating a new variety, it might just simply circulate a variety in a way and might add visibility to that variety. So this is a bit of a more complex answer to something that in media I think people have kind of firmly given the idea that TikTok is causing a new language, when actually it's probably much more complex than that.
Yeah, yeah. And sort of leading on from that, we were chatting in the kitchen the other day about the role of sort of like TikTok in this idea of like language ownership.
Yeah.
So we had a nice specific example of this new show, Amanda Land.
Yeah.
I was just wondering maybe whether you could talk a bit more on that and this idea that there is this like notion of linguistic determinism, but there's also this idea of linguistic ownership, which is perpetrated through digital media, and sort of what's the role of that?
Yeah, so I think we're at a really interesting stage right now where, so as a researcher who concentrates on TikTok, I think we're kind of missing the relevance of the participatory nature of TikTok. So like social media has long been described as participatory culture, which means that there's basically a very low barrier to entry for everyday people. So we've gone from like a centralized media industry that, in broadcast media you have someone who is elevated and people then receive the media, the audience. But in social media that's flattened, right? You have creators producing stuff, what has been called like producerage. Essentially you have this kind of flattened dynamic of who creates and who consumes. And so that means that you then have these people, everyday language users, contributing to linguistic knowledge. And I think as linguists, we have a duty to understand what this means for our theories of language in society. So, like, to give you an example, I'm currently publishing a paper with a colleague in the US, Rhianna Walcott, looking at the appropriation of African American vernacular English, specifically the unpicking the label TikTok language. So lots of people have claimed that there is this variety called TikTok language, and lots of people on the platform itself describe this label. But when you actually look at the features that they describe, a lot of them, according to us, right, have already been described as features of African American vernacular English. And so we have been trying to understand how people basically respond to and contest this claim by looking at videos of people talking about this label. So this means that we're kind of elevating or giving authority to everyday language users as people who have some right or ownership over the language that they use. So this is quite different to what, traditional sociolinguistics has done, which has tended to kind of pigeonhole this approach to like folk linguistics or to kind of not directly relevant to the conversation. But we think that actually these kind of conversations are likely to heavily influence how people use language. So, the conversation that we had was largely about people online there's often this long-standing debate where they think that the way that they say something is distinctive and unlike how anybody else says it. But online, they encounter people who speak other varieties, and they suddenly realize that either they're not the only person who says it like this, or they're not the only speaker or speakers that say it like this. And that can lead to quite an interesting debate as to whether something belongs to X variety or Y variety, or perhaps it's shared. And I think that, for me, as a linguist interested in digital communication, is something we really need to take stock of.
Yes, I really think so. I also think it gives rise to, and this is obviously, I don't work in digital media, but also this idea that somebody will think that it's also the inverse, right? Somebody will think that they do something that everybody else does, and then they're like, wait, hold on, that's not a thing.
Yeah. You see these memes all the time, like on TikTok, where it's like things only X people do.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the comments, it's like a real interesting debate, because people are like, wait, no, I do that too, or I don't do that. Or so I think the participatory nature of social media really does give rise to a whole new kind of dynamic of folk linguistics that people have yet to really understand.
Yeah. And increasing visibility, but also increasing invisibility at the same time. It's kind of like a double-edged sword in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you look at the nature of TikTok or nature of other social media, which are algorithmically organized, right? So if you look at the For You page on TikTok, it's very good at showing you things that you're interested in. But as you say, like that can lead to a situation where you kind of have an overrepresentation of things that you already believe or know, and an underrepresentation of things that you might not believe or don't know. So I equally think we need to think about how that might influence this debate.
Yeah, and languages. Kind of sort of going on from that, social media itself has undergone a lot of changes in recent years. So like even the fact that now we're researching TikTok, whereas like, a couple of years ago TikTok wasn't as big as it is now. And that the pandemic really like accelerated its growth and all of this kind of stuff. I'm just wondering whether you've noticed throughout your research, whether as social media has undergone changes, has language reflected those changes?
That's a really good question. So what I'll do is kind of start from like the 90s, right? So in the 90s, like people like David Crystal basically started contributing to a new research area that they called internet linguistics. And if you think at that time, it was like text-based, IM, right? And it was purely text-based. So all the theories and ideas that they developed were based on text, right? And then social media started transitioning towards like a profile page, right? So with the emergence of, for instance, like Friendster and MySpace, like you suddenly had this kind of profile space which was multimodal. So you had photos, you had messages, you had direct messages, and so on. And that mean that we had to kind of they had to kind of shift the tools that they were using to be able to understand not just text but also the interplay of text with pictures. Still at this stage, the internet is something you logged on to and then you logged off. Like if you think of MySpace, it was on a desktop computer. But in the last 15 or so years, all of that has changed because it's become apps. It's become incredibly multimodal. So you've moved from text first, right, to now what we would call image first platforms like Instagram, like TikTok, and so on. So that has meant that we've had to really refine the tools and understanding of social media away from simply just looking at patterns in text to thinking about like what is the role of images or videos or sounds in all of this debate. So I mean, TikTok's probably the great example because it's an app, it's highly multimodal, and initially people were very dubious about whether social media or whether digital technologies could do anything for language change. Like Peter Truckgirl calls it irrelevant to language change, because his claim is, well, language change takes place in face-to-face interaction. You need accommodation. But look at TikTok and look at like video conferencing platforms like Skype, or well, not Skype, it's going out of business now, but Zoom or Teams. Like, this is face to face, right? And TikTok to me looks so interactive. It looks so dynamic that I think it's probably very important to consider how this might be operating in sociolinguistic dynamics beyond language change, but like ideologies, speaker perception tasks, and so on. So I think this is actually what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, and sort of just from personal experience, networks as well, like community networks. For example, like I remember there was one time that I was meant to type stunning, as in like something was great, so like, oh, stunning, and I was going to type stun, and instead I typed stub. And that has now become the lingo of our group. We're like, oh my god, stub, slay, that's what we say. And it's like that was purely online. That was purely through text. These are my friends from school that we don't see.
Exactly.
And we now all use stub. Stub has become stubbalina, stubbalicious. Like and that's become such an integral part of our lexicon.
Yeah, I think that interaction between offline online language, like that is definitely a simplification, because like in my work I try to basically say that separating the two doesn't really work, but exactly that, it's like if we want to understand language in contemporary society, we need to surely know what's going on online, because as you say, things bleed very easily across different domains. So I do think it's important to understand that.
Yeah, I'll say that to one of my friends that isn't part of this group, and they're like, what?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, something that we do. And I'm like, sorry, like, you didn't know about that. And
you went in that random WhatsApp group.
Yeah, and it's just like my little group from school. They were like, stub. And it's like, okay, fine. That's like, I find this conversation really interesting because it's so relatable. I'm sure a lot of people listening will be like, oh, yeah, like that's an example of what I do. That's what I do. And it's so below the level of consciousness often that people don't think about it. But given the current situation of social media and, the TikTok ban that's happening and the use of social media for political messaging, misinformation, that kind of thing, do you see that as having impacted your research?
So there are people who focus exclusively on, for instance, misinformation and hate speech. And I mean, I have focused less on this because, the vast majority of people that I research are not involved in misinformation. So I think there's a tendency to kind of over-labor how everyday people engage in this. I mean, like, I study youth language. I'm interested in how young people use social media. And I think on the whole, young people are very good and aware of what is fake and what might be incorrect. As I say, like, what's interesting to me is there's often this real like engagement with content in a way that shows critical thinking, right? Like, if you look at the comments of a video that might be problematic or might be questionable in its form, the kind of conversation in the comments is what we ask like students to do, right? To engage critically in what's going on and think about whether what they're saying is accurate or might be critiqued on the basis of empirical evidence. So it's not really a direct focus of my research because I don't really see it very much in the kind of work that I do, but it's obviously a burgeoning area of like discursive inquiry.
And I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I think I don't know what we're up to, but sort of what is the impact of this research both on our understanding of linguistic change, but also the role of social media?
So my research kind of suggests that we kind of overblow the influence of social media to an extent, right? I think it's definitely relevant and definitely important in contemporary society, but I think sometimes people overestimate how much social media actually plays a role in some of this stuff. Like, to give you an example, we published a paper last year that looked at the diffusion of multicultural London English in a very large data set of Twitter messages, so tweets from 2014. And the pattern of diffusion looked like what we would expect in terms of social networks, right? So people who lived in London probably had social networks in places that were kind of near to London, like Luton, and like surrounding areas. And they basically took that language with them, shared it with their networks, and those networks shared that language on. And one of the reviewers questioned, because we hadn't really said much about the influence of social media on the diffusion of MLE Lexis. And well, our data didn't really show any influence of social media. Like, what it showed was a consistent pattern of diffusion that we see in other studies before social media. And I think that that kind of comment suggests to me that people assume the effects of social media before they actually have empirical evidence to suggest otherwise. So I kind of, wrote back and said, well, actually, I don't think there is an influence of social media. Like, you might expect one, but our data doesn't have any evidence for that. So I think it's about bringing it back to earth and saying, yes, like there's going to be effects, but it's really not dramatic, or it's not very different to other innovations that we've seen elsewhere where language change has responded to those innovations.
Yeah, and I've got 2 questions left.
Yep.
First one, what advice would you give to someone looking to get into this kind of research?
Yeah. Okay, so there's one bit of advice that I'll give, because a lot of people think that studying digital culture or social media is like either, well, what's the point? It's all going to change, right? Like, I get that quite a lot, and it's like, well, the platform might change, but the mechanisms will probably stay the same. So, like, I started studying appropriation of African American vernacular English in Twitter. I then now have studied it in TikTok. I have studied it in Instagram. Like, and sure, the platform might move on, but the mechanisms of the things that people engage in socially are likely quite consistent. So, I look at work from the 90s, and some of it now looks, relatively dated, but there are ideas in that work that still persist, even if we're not, sitting down at a computer and surfing the net, right? Like, things have changed so much that we are now, always on, we're always networked. But some of those ideas still exist. So I would say, like, don't get despondent about, well, it might just still shut down, or it might change. Like, clearly given how important and how relevant social media is in our lives, we need to understand it, right? We need to start somewhere. So I think that is my kind of key bit of advice for somebody interested in this work.
Fabulous. Okay, and our last question is a big one.
And
I think you've kind of already answered it.
Okay.
But this is based on your plenary talk, which you'll be doing at LVC. Does social media cause language change, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I kind of suggested earlier that we should move away from looking at media effects on language change. So the question is, so where do we move to? And the answer is, well, there's been work which has argued that actually what we should look at is not language change, but sociolinguistic change. And we should not look at media effects, but mediatization. So let me break this down for you. So language change is quite a narrow perception of how we use language, right? We used form A at one point in time, and now we use form B. Sociolinguistic change is, okay, it might include we use form A and then we use form B, but it also includes things like ideology. So like, how do what is your perception of the speakers or the speech community? It also includes things like representation of speakers. So if you have never heard somebody from Shetland before, and then you get on TikTok and you see somebody speaking the dialect, like how do you perceive them,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So what does that mean for your understanding of that individual and the speech community? So this is a much broader understanding of how media might be involved in sociolinguistics. So mediatization basically is how these processes of media, like things like social media and digital culture, what they mean for society, and in the context of sociolinguistics, what they mean for sociolinguistic processes like, you know, yeah, perception, ideology, and so on. So I've done quite a lot of work try to understand the sociolinguistic dynamics of mediatization, and I think it's a very complex question. But I think, um, studying things like TikTok allow us to show that actually, these funny little videos are actually quite important for how we perceive people. So, like I mentioned one earlier about the kind of contestation of TikTok language as being actually African American vernacular English. And I think in that debate, what's really interesting is you have everyday language users who are acting as linguists, right? Yep. So they are essentially doing the job that we do. They're using the participatory affordances of TikTok to promote linguistic knowledge. And I think that really is relevant to what we're interested in, right? I mean, if you have somebody online describing a particular variety and that is being consumed by everyday people, that is likely to affect how people use language. And the representation of speakers, you can think of like how people mock or parody particular varieties online. What does that mean for those varieties that they're mocking? Equally, you have in the context of like minoritized languages, you have now speakers who use those languages actively campaigning for their rights online. I think this is really interesting in terms of like making, language rights more democratic. So, like, we've moved very far away from like, do we use, Form A now versus Form B? But I think all of this is important to understanding that.
Yeah, and the media's a tool to sort of investigate that.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Well, that has been really interesting.
Great.
Thank you, Christian.